In this video, we will have a critical introduction of 1st and 2nd Kings. In the Hebrew Bible, 1st and 2nd King concludes the book of the former prophets. In the Septuagint, it's called 3rd and 4th Kingdoms, which continues 1st and 2nd Kingdoms, which we would call 1st and 2nd Samuel. 1st and 2nd Kings covers Israel's history from Solomon to the end of the monarchy. Starts with the rise of Solomon around 970 BC. It'll talk about the division of the monarchy into Israel and Judah when Solomon's successor, Rehoboam, unsuccessfully managed the kingdom and led to a revolt under Jeroboam the first, who established the northern tribes as a separate kingdom. It'll discuss the destruction of Samaria in 722 BC and the Assyrian exile of the 10 northern tribes that brings the northern kingdom of Israel to an end. And then it'll continue on down to the destruction of Jerusalem in 587-586 and the Babylonian exile of the southern kingdom. As far as authorship, the authorship is unknown. Some rabbis in the Talmud ascribed the book to Jeremiah. Read about that in the Talmud Baba Batra 15a. Critical scholars attribute it to the Deuteronomists. We discuss the Deuteronomistic history theory in the book of Joshua. The book does mention that Jehoiachin, king of Israel, who was exiled to Babylon, was released from confinement in Babylon while in the exile and dates it to around 562 BC. So the book could not have been completed until after that event. The exile ends in 539 when Cyrus allows Jews to return to begin rebuilding, but the book does not mention that, so that suggests that perhaps Kings was completed during the exile between 562 and 539 BC. The Book of Kings acknowledges that it uses sources at a number of points. There's mention of the Book of the Acts of Solomon in 1 Kings 11:41. It refers to the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, which is a official royal document, not to be confused with the Book of Chronicles that we have in our Bibles. And then there's the Book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah that's mentioned at several points. And it's likely that the Elijah and the Elisha cycles or stories may have been independent sources before being incorporated into Kings. The purpose of Kings is to continue the history of Israel that ends with 2 Samuel. And it does so in a way that gives a prophetic view of history. It discusses how each king dealt with God and vice versa from this prophetic perspective. It shows the importance of the Davidic dynasty. That is, it concentrates on Davidic kings and their role in Israel's history. It was written to explain the exile. It explains the sins and covenant violations that led God to send both Israel in 722 BC, and that's talked about in 2 Kings 17, and Judah into into exile. In the case of Israel, Assyrian exile. In the case of Judah, Babylonian exile. A very broad outline of the two books is this. Begins with the reign of Solomon, which is the first 11 chapters. Then it describes the divided kingdom from chapters 12 of 1 Kings to chapter 17 of 2 Kings. And then after the northern kingdom comes to an end, then it'll tell the story of Judah by itself, without Northern Kingdom being involved, from the days of Hezekiah until they come to the exile, and that's the rest of the book. A bit of a theological overview of 1st and 2nd Kings. Kings builds on the theological themes of Samuel, especially the election of David and the role of the prophets. It substitutes emphasis on Solomon's temple for Samuel's emphasis on the ark. Overall, the purpose seems to be to explain to a later generation why, despite God's election of Israel and his promised covenant with David, that Israel still ended up in exile. Here's a few particulars. One theme is that covenant violations lead to exile. First of all, the Assyrian exile. The non-Davidic kings of the northern kingdom of Israel led the north to be taken away into exile. 2 Kings 17 actually catalogs the covenant violations. They worshipped other gods. They were idolatrous, worshiping God in an idolatrous way in the high places, or even in some cases worshiping other gods on these high places. They had human sacrifice. There was divination. They practiced sorcery. And generally they failed to heed God's warnings through the prophets. And that's why the northern tribes went into exile. But unfortunately, the same thing happens to Judah too, which leads to the Babylonian exile. Judah too fell into the same practices, and this happened despite the attempts of godly kings like Asa and Jehoshaphat and Hezekiah and Josiah to put down the idolatrous worship and to promote obedience to God's law. Or as 2 Kings 24:20 puts it, it was because of the Lord's anger that all this happened to Jerusalem and Judah, and in the end he thrusts them from his presence. The Babylonian exile, from the prophetic point of view of history, is considered an act of God. That leads us to the idea of a prophetic view of history. A prophetic view of history emphasizes the role of God working providentially in and through history. In a prophetic view of history, the author, as a prophet, is able to tell us what God is thinking and doing throughout Israel's history. And this is why the Hebrew Bible places Kings among the books of the prophets, because it's considered a prophetic history. Among the places where it implies a prophetic view of history, it says that the Lord gave Solomon wisdom in 1 Kings 5. It says that Ahab's idolatry provoked the Lord to anger in 1 Kings 16. It says that the Lord reduced the size of the northern kingdom in 2 Kings 10:32. It says that the Lord provided a deliverer for Israel in 2 Kings 13. It says that Hezekiah was successful because the Lord was with him in 2 Kings 18. And it says that the Lord afflicted Azariah with leprosy in 2 Kings 15:5. And you have many, many examples of these kinds of statements in the book, a sort of thing that no secular historian would ever say. And even from the point of view of the Bible, I mean, it's true that Babylon invaded for their own selfish purposes, but the biblical writer saw in and behind that the purposes of God working providentially to use the selfish purposes of kings and nations to accomplish God's will. A third theme that we'll mention is at least a hint of messianic hope. Now, throughout this account of Kings, there is some emphasis on the Davidic monarchy, starting with Solomon, who was a Davidic king, and then with the divided monarchy, how the Davidic king had to deal with problems of the split of the kingdom, And then the last part of the story tells about how from Hezekiah to the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the monarchy, all the kings that are involved there and over Judah would be Davidic kings. In other words, these books show the importance of the Davidic promise plan in God's program. And from our Christian perspective, we know why there was such an emphasis, because the Davidic monarchy culminates in King Jesus, the Messiah, who is of the lineage of David. The end of the book mentions Jehoiakim's survival, that he was taken to exile and that he was released from imprisonment. And this would have given hope to the reader that perhaps someday that the Davidic line would be restored. Now, a descendant of Jehoiakim is going to be Zerubbabel, and through Zerubbabel will come the lineage of Jesus Christ. So that hope was not without some foundation. So that's a very brief critical introduction to the book of Kings.